Okay, good evening, everybody. So, welcome to quarto encontro de literatura em língua inglesa. A dança continua. 30 anos de Wise Children, de Angela Carter. A pluralidade da literatura de autoria feminina. So, tonight we have I think it's the 6th conference, right? That we'll have this conference in English because we have with us today Joanna Scott. And first, I would like to thank Joanna Scott for being here with us, to spare the time to be with us today, participating in this event. I would also like to thank the organization committee of the event and the monitors that are helping us throughout all of this live presentations and conferences and everything that we have. And I would also like to thank the participants that have been kind enough to participate in the event, to comment, and to be part of this, because without the participants, we wouldn't have an event. Also, I'd like to remind you that we'll have some time for questions and comments later after the talk. So if you want to comment or ask any questions, you can put them on the YouTube chat, the live chat. If it is in Portuguese, we'll do our best to translate it. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker today. So Joanna Scott is an American novelist, short story writer, and essayist. She graduated from Trinity College and earned a master's degree from Brown University. She received an honorary doctor title of letters from Trinity College also. She's the author of 11 books, including The Mannequin, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, Various Antidotes, and Arrogance, which were both finalists for the PEN/Faulkner Award, and the critically acclaimed Make Believe, Tourmaline, Liberation, Follow Me, and The Potter's Grand Tour. She is a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Lena Award. So, in addition to her work as an author, she has had a career in academia, teaching at the University of Maryland and the University of Rochester, where she's currently the Roswell Smith Burroughs Professor of English. Okay, so I also would like to comment on my personal experience meeting Joanna Scott last year. As we were talking before, just a few weeks before all of the pandemic started in the United States in Millsville, which was an amazing experience to hear her talking about biofiction and her work with this book, which I have here, Careers for Women. This is how we met, because she unfortunately has not been published in Brazil yet, but hopefully in the next years. And so today she's going to talk about her experience, like as an author and the professor of English, and about literature in itself. So I'll thank you very much, Joanna, for being with us today, and you can illuminate us with your talk.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for those who are viewing right now. Thank you, Deborah. It is wonderful to be here. I wish we could all be in person. Deborah's reminding me that was the last in person when we met in Milledgeville, Georgia, the little town of Milledgeville. We met in the Flannery O'Connor Library, or in the library reading, both of us, Flannery O'Connor. And it was, just as doors were about to close, just as the pandemic was starting to become a very pressing reality across the world. So much has changed since then. But I'm glad we can all gather this way. And today, and thank you for allowing me to speak in English. I thank you for your patience, and I hope I can make myself clear. Please, if when I share my screen, I'm not going to be able to see you, but I can still hear you. So if you have any questions, or if something's not clear, or if my sound's not audible or something, please just shout, and then I can exit the screen, and we can figure out any problems. But okay, I'm going to talk about the way as a writer of fiction, I am called upon to constantly make up things, to imagine things, to uh, create imaginative worlds out of language and encourage readers to think imaginatively. And what I find myself interested in these days is the way we, in reading a novel or a story, a work of fiction, we can see writers writing about imagination, not just imagining, but giving their characters opportunities to imagine. And we can learn about reading, we can learn about imagination through that dramatization of it in fiction. So I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking a little bit about the history of imagination and bring in some images. So I'm going to share my screen here, and let me see how this goes. I'm going to share the window and share that. And so here you have my screen, and now I'm going to take you through, start this PowerPoint here. You might know of an American television series called The Twilight Zones. This is one of the openings of it.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
So the way we think about imagination, I actually think that introduction to the Twilight Zone from the 1950s puts it beautifully. This in-between space between science and superstition. Imagination is located in that space. And depending on who you're talking to, sometimes we think of imagination as being a very dangerous thing, and sometimes a very productive thing. Often in culture, imagination is associated with children. It's considered an innocent, uh, easy thing to do, and we want to cultivate imagination in children. Another way to think about imagination is as an entrepreneurial thing. Imagination leads to innovation. This is an advertisement for General Electric. For years, they had a slogan, "Live better electrically," and then they changed their slogan to include the word progress, and there were different iterations of that. And then in the early 2000s, after a year of brainstorming, they came up with this slogan, GE, Imagination at Work. And that slogan won a top prize at a national competition. But it shows you how imagination is considered, in some ways, a very useful, productive process. On the other hand, we know that imagination can be associated with excess, instability, and insanity. And you think this is a painting of Ophelia from Hamlet in the Act 4, Scene 5. If you know Shakespeare's play, Ophelia comes in and she's lost in a hallucination. She starts to sing. She addresses people who aren't there. She says famously, "I hope all will be well. We must be patient, but I cannot choose but weep to think they should lay him in the cold ground. My brother shall know of it. And so I thank you for your good counsel. Come, my coach. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night." So the imagination is not looking so friendly and innocent in that iteration. Or in this. This is a poem by the American writer Joyce Carol Oates, in which she tells the story of a young girl being assaulted late at night. But then on the second page, you can see what happens when the girl tries to tell her story. Uh, there is no blood except from her scraped knees. There is no scar or enduring wound except the nighttime tale, the memory. It is always night. She cannot not remember it as night. There wasn't an afternoon. She was returning home from school, descending the steps from the street, an old route, absolutely safe by daylight. Still, she remembers the episode taking place at night in which she will be proved 20 years later a liar. As for the rest of the tale, isn't it fictitious? You've always had too much imagination, she is told. So that's a danger, to have too much imagination. And yet we need imagination to make art, to create stories. The British social scientist Daniel Nettles, author of a book called Strong Imagination, and I love that title, Strong Imagination, in an interview talks about the pros and cons of imagination, that it allows us to talk to each other about the future, the past, the absent, and the mythological, but we can also hallucinate and obsess and become diverted into mental loops that are unhealthy for us. Clearly, the psychological power of human imagination, when harnessed to a set of moods, needs, and rhythms, can be wonderfully productive, and it can also go wrong. Both potentials are there. So let's think about how imagination has been treated by writers over many years. And a good place to start is in Plato's cave, his allegory of the cave. Um, the if you know the allegory from Plato's Republic, you will recall that at the end of a long passage, there is an underground chamber, and the entrance is open to light, and the prisoners are chained to the wall, an illustration here. And what they see are shadows, almost like a puppet show of shadows on the wall. And they think that's all there is. There's just shadows. That's reality. But Socrates asks us to imagine that one of the fellows goes above ground, and after letting his eyes adjust, he sees the original images that are making the shadows and gazes upon the sun. And then he comes back down to tell the other prisoners. And the parable ends, if they, the fellow prisoners, could lay hands on the man who was trying to set them free and lead them up, they would kill him. They think they know reality. They can't imagine anything beyond the illusions that they see. So in an overview of the history of imagination, the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetics accuses or credits Plato with launching what they call a tradition of distrust. And I love that. That should be the title of this talk, a tradition of distrust that continues to this day. The object of distrust is imagination. Imagination is something that misleads us to the wrong conclusion, as the parable of the cave would have it. At the same time, in order to know the truth, we have to be willing to imagine an outside, another reality, something that we can't see. Imagination reinforces illusions, but in order to understand that, we need imagination. Now, there is no set of stories that better represents the conflicted reputation of imagination, I think, than Ovid's Metamorphosis. And if you know some of the stories that Ovid tells so beautifully, a nymph is turned into a tree, woman who is too talented as a weaver is turned by a jealous goddess into a spider. And you might know this story. This is the famous story of Pygmalion, who is a sculptor and makes a sculpture so beautiful that he starts to desire it and imagine it as a real living person. And Venus, the goddess Venus, hears his thoughts, hears him pleading, hears his prayers, and she animates this ivory girl. The statue comes to life under Pygmalion's fingers. The wax grows soft in sunshine. The ivory girl blinks. She blushes. She is alive. But it's interesting to keep reading this story, to keep following it through Ovid's Metamorphosis, because that is not the end of it. The story, as it continues, turns toward horror with such relentless momentum that the poet warns his audience, "The story is terrible. I warn you, fathers, daughters had better skip this part. Or if you like my songs, distrust me here and say it never happened. Or if you do believe it, take my word that it was paid for. Nature, it may be, permits such things to happen." This terrible story that Ovid suggests we skip because it's so scary, tells us that Pygmalion's statue that comes to life has a daughter. The daughter has a son. The son is Cinyras, who has his own daughter, Mira, who sets in motion a very different kind of transformation. Mira lusts after her father. She tricks him into sleeping with her, and then she flees in disgrace. She pleads from release from life and is transformed into a tree, and her tears become myrrh. And as a tree, she gives birth to a son, beautiful Adonis, that little boy whose sister became his mother, his grandfather's son. So Mira is the link. Then we have Mira here as the tree and Adonis coming out of the tree, between Pygmalion's desire and the incestuous mix that results in little Adonis. So if we keep following Ovid's story of artistic creation, we see that imagination doesn't stop with beautiful statues. As the image-making faculty of the mind, imagination continues through a long, complicated process, breaking taboos, confronting horror, blending, discarding, reshaping experience, producing great beauty, but at great expense. Through its history, the concept of imagination in its various incarnations has been treated with disdain, with skepticism, with reverence, with curiosity, and sometimes not treated at all. Imaginative thought can seem a weak echo to observation, without vivacity, no more than a shadow flickering on the wall of a cave. But measured against other components of perception, imaginative thought becomes an essential ingredient, a means for making associations, synthesizing the chaos of experience, and giving us the ability to approach the most evasive truths. So for those of us who are involved in reading and writing imaginative literature, imagination is a crucial process. We're using language to create mental impressions. When we read a novel, a story, a fictional story, we rely on imagination, on imaginative thought. Events, characters, everything is spun from words. We usually don't have the picture in front of us. The experience of fiction invites us to consider the implications of imagination. And when we start thinking about implications, we can't help but start imagining. So now let me think about what writers have done to get us to imagine. And this is from such an interesting novel, and it's really hard to track down. I stumbled across it in my own library when I was looking for something else. It's called The Parasite. It's by an anonymous author. It was published in England in 1765 by a printer named G. Burnett. And I think it gives us a wonderful example of what writers are doing when they are inviting readers to imagine. So in this book, the book tells a story of a protagonist named Dick Swallow. And Dick Swallow, supposedly at the beginning of the book, comes knocking on the author's door and says, "I want you to write a story about me." And the author says, "Okay." And then Dick Swallow takes off, and the author tries to keep up with him, but it's hard. Dick Swallow, the main character, is fast, and the author loses sight of him at a certain point. And what I'm showing here, I don't have the actual page because I can't get access. The micro form that I use doesn't exist anymore now, I think. So we have to search hard for an actual copy of this book. But what the anonymous writer does very early in the novel is say to the reader, "Reader, it's your turn. You supply the remainder of this chapter with the most valuable notes, observations, commentaries, various readings, etc., 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 as they shall find suitable, instructive, and ornamental." And then he offers an entire blank page for readers to write upon. So it's probably the first interactive novel ever written. It's wonderfully inventive, and despite the relative cost of paper back then in 1765, the printer agreed to put in this book an entire blank page that the reader could write upon. And then to give, the author goes on, full swing to fancy, genius, invention, wit, humor, sense, learning, and erudition, which exceeding all bounds must of course surpass all expectations. So fiction asks us to imagine. Some particularly artful works of fiction ask us to imagine imagining. And that's really what I'm after today, to think about imagining. The writer Edgar Allan Poe created a detective named Monsieur Auguste Dupin, who offers a really good example of the way imagination can be directed to mystery. Some of you might know, I hope it's translated into Portuguese, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in English in 1841. And in this story, the detective Dupin is trying to solve a murder that has taken place in a room, in an apartment in the Rue Morgue. There are a few key clues, but it all is very baffling. And he goes with the narrator of the story to the room. He looks around, and then he leaves. And what fascinates me about this story is that he solves the problem when he's away from the room. Not when he's looking, but when he's imagining. And here's the quote: "The analytical power should not be confounded with simple ingenuity, for while the analyst is necessarily ingenious, the ingenious man is often remarkably incapable of analysis. The constructive or combining power by which ingenuity is usually manifested, and which the phrenologists, I believe erroneously, have assigned a separate organ, supposing it a primitive faculty, has been so frequently seen in those whose intellect bordered otherwise upon idiocy as to have attracted general observation among writers on morals. Between ingenuity and the analytic ability, there exists a difference far greater, indeed, than that between the fancy and the imagination, but of a character very strictly analogous. It will be found, in fact, that the ingenious are always fanciful, and the truly imaginative never otherwise than analytic. And I just love that because it helps us to understand how imagination, imaginative thought, can be brought to bear on a problem that requires really hard, logical, deductive thinking. And what Monsieur Dupin, the detective, does at this point is to say to his friend, let us now transport ourselves in fancy to this chamber. What shall we first seek here? So he asks the narrator and he asks the reader to think imaginatively about what's not there in front of him. There are so many intriguing elements, I feel, to Dupin's process here, but two seem particularly relevant to a discussion of how imagination is represented in literature. The first is Dupin's immediate invitation. He's not going to pursue this inquiry alone or simply report on the results. He expects his audience to imagine with him. Let us now go. And second, he proceeds into the fantasy through a series of questions, framing the blank space as mystery. What shall we first seek here? And then he goes on to ask more questions. How did the murderer escape? What can we know? The more challenging the questions, the more innovative answers they inspire. And Dupin shows us that to pry into a mystery, we need to look into dark places, up chimneys, and into closets. And I'm not going to tell you what the solution to the mystery is if you haven't read the story, because it's very surprising and I don't want to spoil the fun. But we need to consider, Dupin is saying, what we don't yet know. And in order to do that, we need imagination. So, what do black radishes have to do with imagination? We go to sleep, we dream. And in dreaming, according to Sigmund Freud, we take up remnants of trivial experiences which go into dream content after being subjected to dream distortion. And you might know his incredibly influential interpretation of dreams. Freud, I just picked out one example. He tells of a dream. He describes many dreams in that book, but there's one dream in which a woman goes to the butcher. She doesn't find anything she wants, so she goes to the greengrocer, who tries to send her a black bundle of some kind of strange vegetable. And so Freud, in his interpretation of this dream, says that the bundled vegetable can be none other than a dream combination of asparagus and black radish, which, of course, as Freud says, because he's Freud, represents a sexual theme. And Freud himself fancies that he's figured in the dream. He is the butcher, telling the young woman that the experiences of childhood are no longer to be obtained. The woman's dream, he assures us at the conclusion of his interpretation, is not guileless, not innocent at all. A dream is never innocent. So in Freud's account of truths hidden within the distortions of a dream, the imagining mind makes up fantasies in the form of unreal scenes, whether it's daydreams, which is what an author's doing, or dreams of sleep. We all do. And the success of the fantasies is determined, here's a quote from Freud, by the advantages they can offer us against the claims of the censorship and the pressure of condensation. The force of the imagination becomes for Freud a complex network of desire, repression, distortion, expression, and it's all necessary to psychic health, and yet resistant to the disciplines of consciousness. And while the imagining mind may produce great art, it does so through fantasies inflected with infantile desires and primitive, what he calls psychical antiquities. And there's nothing we can do to stop it. But this quote is, I feel, just so interesting and helpful to us in understanding how what we're doing when we are interpreting imaginative thinking. In the best interpreted dreams, we often have to leave one passage in obscurity because we observe during the interpretation that we have here a tangle of dream thoughts which cannot be unraveled and which furnishes no fresh contribution to the dream content. This, then, is the keystone of the dream, the point at which it ascends into the unknown. For the dream thoughts which we encounter during the interpretation commonly have no termination, but run in all directions into the net-like entanglement of our intellectual world. It is from some denser part of this fabric that the dream wish then arises, like the mushroom from its mycelium. So that keystone, the keystone of the dream, we can't know it. There's something at the center of imaginative thought that resists our attempts to understand it. The fantasizing mind with its net-like entanglement protects its mysteries, disguising unwanted thoughts so cleverly that they can elude even an interpretive effort as elaborate as Freud's. So Freud is really continuing that tradition of distrust. Because of imagination, we can't help but make mistakes and be misled, but it's also essential to our health, our well-being, our to knowledge itself. Imagination isn't simply a childish game. So even if a dream is a tangle of lies, it tells us something about who we are, or more precisely, and this is, we thank Freud for this, more precisely, who we think we are. Even if the shadows in the cave are illusions, to understand the parable, we need to begin by imagining it, which is why, paradoxically, distrust of imaginative thought often has the effect of generating fascination. You might know the story from Gertrude Stein's autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, of the portrait that the painter Picasso painted of the writer Gertrude Stein. In the story that she tells, she said, now there might be some, she was known for exaggerating, but Stein says that Picasso sat down in his little kitchen chair, very close to his canvas with a very small palette, and he tried to paint her head, her face that you see here, 80 or 90 times. He tried to paint it from various angles. He tried to paint it day after day, sitting after sitting, and he felt he couldn't get it right. And this is a radiograph. It's so interesting to see it because they can look under the final painting and see the different, can you see this? The different angles of earlier incarnations of the portrait of Gertrude Stein. Find this utterly, speaking of fascination, utterly fascinating. One day he got frustrated, so frustrated with this that he just painted it out, painted blank, and then stopped. He said he couldn't do it. He couldn't see her. I can't see you. any longer when I look. Well, they went their separate ways. Picasso came back, and Stein tells us that when she returned from her trip, she came back to her finished portrait. The day he returned from Spain, Picasso sat down and out of his head painted the head in without having seen Gertrude Stein again. When she saw it, he and she were content. It is very strange, but neither can remember at all what the head looked like when he painted it out. And here's the final finished portrait. But what's so key here is that the painting was done in her absence, that it had to be done imaginatively in order for Picasso to finish it. So it makes sense that a force as complex as imagination would inspire oppositional responses. Distrust tends to focus on the distorting effects of imagination, while the defenders locate our imaginative ability and in our imaginative ability a special kind of insight or illumination. Some writers will say that in the face of disaster, imaginative literature is useless. And then others, in the face of disaster and tragedy, will say what we have to do is make up stories, go on making art. We can blame imagination for superstition. We can argue in favor of reason, or we can argue in favor of fancy and wild invention. The argument generates many interesting ideas and its opposing positions. But what we tend to see in literary representations of imagination in action is a kind of the opposition comes together to create a really interesting ambivalent representation of imagination. When we have writers writing about characters who imagine, it's rarely an easy thing to do. It comes tinged with sometimes frustration or melancholy. It is certainly a complex action. So let me the story. Let's see what time. So I'm going to just finish by talking about the story about called "The Jolly Corner" by Henry James. Published. The version I'm using was published in 1918. And it tells the story of a man named Spencer Bryden who is born in New York and raised in New York, but he leaves New York, he leaves the United States and goes to live abroad and stays abroad for several decades. Then he comes back and he has to sell his house, or he's making some real estate transactions, and his childhood house is empty. And he starts to think about the person he would have become if he had stayed in that house, if he had stayed in New York. And here he's asking about how he would have been changed over the decades. What would it have made of me? What would it have made of me? I keep forever wondering, all idiotically, as if I could possibly know. I see what it has made of dozens of others, those I meet, and it positively aches within me to the point of exasperation, that it would have made something of me as well, only I can't make out what. And the worry of it, the small rage of curiosity, never to be satisfied, brings back what I remember to have felt once or twice after judging best for reasons to burn some important letter unopened. I've been sorry, I've hated it. I've never known what was in the letter. Now, this is the perfect metaphor for imagining the unopened letter that is burned. What was in it? We can't know, but we can imagine. And that's what Spencer Bryden does. He compares himself at a certain point to a flower, and his friend May Staverson says, you wonder about the flowers, so do I, if you want to know. I've been wondering, and I think wondering is equivalent of imagining these several weeks. I believe in the flower, she continued. I feel it would have been quite splendid, quite huge and monstrous. Monstrous above all, her visitor, Spencer Bryden echoed, and I imagine by the same stroke, quite hideous and offensive. So what they're doing, Spencer Bryden and his friend, Miss Staverton, are imagining more and more what he would have been, to the point where Spencer Bryden, walking alone in that childhood house at night, imagines so hard that he actually sees himself in a vision. And here's a description of the alt ego, the other self that he confronts in his house. Rigid and conscious, spectral yet human, a man of his own substance and stature waited there to measure himself with his power to dismay. This only could it be. This only till he recognized with his advance that what made the face dim was a pair of raised hands that covered it. So his characters, like the vision's face is covered with his hands like this, buried as for dark deprecation. So Bryden before him took him in, with every fact of him now in the higher light, hard and acute, his planted stillness, his vivid truth, his grizzled bent head and white masking hands, his queer actuality of evening dress, of dangling double eyeglass, of gleaming silk lappet and white linen, of pearl button and gold watch guard and polished shoe. No portrait by a great modern master could have presented him with more intensity, thrust him out of his frame with more art, as if there had been treatment of the consummate sort in his every shade and salience. So the vision that Bryden has is so real. He says it couldn't have been better made by an artist. But then something else happens. The vision, so vividly described and somewhat uncharacteristically for James, very visually described, full of imagery. Bryden is looking at him. Save, though, would it be? Bryden breathed his wonder till the very impunity of his attitude and the very insistence of his eyes produced, as he felt, a sudden stir, which showed the next instant as a deeper portent, while the head raised itself, the betrayal of a braver purpose. The hands, as he looked, began to move, to open, as if deciding in a flash, dropped from the face and left it uncovered and presented. Horror with the sight had leaped into Bryden's throat, gasping there in a sound he couldn't utter, for the bared identity was too hideous as his, and his glare was the passion of his protest. The face, that face, Spencer Bryden's, he searched it still, but looking away from it in dismay and denial, falling straight from his height of sublimity, it was unknown, inconceivable, awful, disconnected from any possibility. And notice what he does here. He moves from this amazingly detailed portrait of the figure, uncovers the face, and doesn't tell us what we are supposed to see. Right at the moment that Bryden's imagination has become real in this figure of a ghost, we as readers are being challenged to imagine. All we know is that it's horrible. All we know is that it's a face. We don't know what it looks like. We are left to imagine. Here's somewhat, it's a little hard to tell, but there's a figure at the top of the stairs, actually sort of cut off in this illustration, but it's a neat illustration of the story. One last, two last quotes, just to think about how writers have picked up on this idea of imagining imagining. And this, you might know this very short fiction from the Irish writer Samuel Beckett, Imagination, Dead Imagine. This is how it begins. No trace anywhere of life, you say, Pa, no difficulty there. Imagination not dead yet. Yes, dead, good. Imagination, dead, imagine. Islands, waters, azure, verdure, one glimpse and vanished, endlessly omit, till all white in the whiteness of rotunda. No way in. Go in, measure. Diameter 3 feet, 3 feet from ground to summit of the vault. 2 diameters at right angles, A, B, C, D. Divide the white ground into 2 semicircles, A, C, B, B, D, A, lying on the ground, 2 white bodies, each in a semicircle, white to the vault, and the round wall 18 inches high from which it springs. So Beckett, in saying imagination is dead, imagine that. That's what he's asking us to do. And he's presenting us with the possibility of imagining delineation when the delineation is all the same color. It's white on white. It's really not that far from that 18th century novel, The Parasite, where the anonymous author asks us, fill in the blank page, reader. Do what you want. This is, now I know you've been thinking and talking about the wonderful Angela Carter. And I just grabbed to finish off this quote from her wonderful story, The Bloody Chamber, as our protagonist, our narrator, is being taken away, leaving behind her childhood home. She is imagining what her mother is doing at that moment. I tenderly imagine how at this very moment my mother would be moving slowly about the narrow bedroom I had left behind forever, folding up and putting away all my little relics, the tumbled garments I would not need anymore, the scores for which there had been no rooms in my trunks, the concert programs I'd abandoned. She would linger over this torn ribbon and that faded photograph with all the half joyous, half sorrowful emotions of a woman on her daughter's wedding day. And in the midst of my bridal triumph, I felt a pang of loss, as if, when he put the gold band on my finger, I had, in some ways, ceased to be her child in becoming his wife. In the very imagining she does there, she is learning about herself. It's not unlike what, in some ways, Dupin is doing. He's learning. In Poe's story, he's learning about the event that took place in his absence. We learn by imagining, but we can also be misled by imagining. As our visionary guide, it offers us access to a space where there is no other way in. It may illuminate or distort, synthesize or repeat or invent. Imagination can be studied as a defining characteristic of a culture or a defining trait of an individual. We can blame it for our bad dreams, our failed loves, our superstitions, our awful mistakes. We can thank it for our intelligence, our creativity, our inventions, our games, our works of art. It answers questions with questions. It's a force behind literature. It is the great pretender. It tries to trick us to believe in make-believe. It can be as frivolous as it is serious. It is something we're supposed to outgrow, but we never outgrow it. It fails us in the midst of atrocity. It revives us in the aftermath of atrocity. Imagination expands the universe, time, and our sense of possibility. It blurs reality. It unsettles us. It hesitates at death's door. And then it goes right in. So I will end there. Thank you for listening to my little, hang on a sec. Exploration. Uh-oh.
Well, it's all right. I think everything's fine.
I lost you. Hang on a sec. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. I can't see you for some reason.
Oh, okay. I think you'll find the StreamYard there somewhere
Ah,
in your screen.
oh my gosh. Where are you? I can hear you.
Okay, that's a good
Yeah.
sign then.
Okay. All right. That sounds good.
But yeah, I mean, you'd probably be able to find there somewhere your tab for StreamYard. But I was thinking, before we take any comments from the audience and all, I wanted to comment a little bit
Oh,
on.
there you
It may be a little bit off topic, but not so much because you just mentioned Angela Carter in your final quote. And I remember you mentioning something in the emails or something about meeting her briefly. And I was imagining how that might have been.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
would like you to talk a little bit about this.
Sure,
If you
sure.
can.
I she was friends with a teacher of mine at Brown University. Actually, the I met her even before that because when I graduated from college, I went to work in New York City, and I worked at a literary agency down in Greenwich Village. It was the name of the uh, agent was Elaine Markson, and she represented Angela Carter in the United States. She represented her work, and so when I went over to England at a certain point, Elaine Markson put me in touch with Angela Carter. So I got to visit her. I went over to her house. She gave me a little tour through some of her favorite spots in Soho. She told me what coffee to buy and what cheese to buy, and I watched her. She in the house. She had little budgies that just flew free and out of the cage, and so we sat there where the little birds flew around inside the house. So she's a wonderful, wonderful woman.
Oh,
So
yeah.
talented.
I can imagine that. It might have been wonderful.
Mhm.
Yes. Because we have, as I think I have mentioned, we have like a professor here that like her whole career was studying Angela Carter show. So I
Oh,
think she just
wonderful,
commented amazing because
wonderful.
I think everybody that studies literature like would welcome the chance of meeting the person they studied. Or
Uh-huh,
not, I don't
uh-huh.
know. Personally, I don't know if Flannery O'Connor would welcome everyone.
I
So
know.
I will never know. But
I actually here's something that Flannery O'Connor had a correspondence. You might know this with a writer named John Hawkes, who taught at
yes.
Brown. He was my
Uh-huh.
teacher there, and
Oh,
and
really?
and
Oh.
yeah, and we called him Jack Hawkes, and he was a wild writer, and he wild and uh, yeah, a writer who was, much more in line with Angela Carter or with the fellow writer Robert Coover, if you know his work.
Mhm.
And so the very fact that Flannery O'Connor was corresponding with Jack, they have a long correspondence. They argue a lot, but I think they were very fond of each other. So Angela Carter and John Hawkes and Angela Carter were friends. So there is a connection there.
There is a connection.
Yeah.
We're all connected.
Yeah.
So, in line of the imagination thing, I was wondering when you mentioned the anonymous book,
Hmm.
and I was remembering Virginia Woolf's A Roof of One's On when she's talking about imagining like maybe a lot of times in history the anonymous were women writers, right? And they were
Hmm.
I was when you mentioned the work like the book from the was it the 18th century
Hmm. Hmm.
in England, I was like, okay, I think this anonymous, I was just imagining her as a woman writer because it's like
I love that. I love that. Absolutely. That's perfect. There's a famous novel by Lawrence Stern from that same period called Tristram Shandy,
mhm,
and in that novel, he has when his good friend Yorick dies, uh, Stern follows that scene with a totally a page covered with black ink. So it's the opposite of the parasite. Instead of writing on it, there's no writing, and one can't write on it. It's totally covered with black ink. So I like the idea that this is that the author is a woman. I think that makes a ton of sense, as opposed to the author Lawrence Stern, who gave us a page full of ink.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I
Yeah.
think there was a comment here like let's try our translation skills right now. I think Isabella said that you're like you pointed out the difference between the extravagant and imagination was like an enlightening pointing it out, and you like have highlighted very well the question of the analytic ability and how it is connected to imagination. So I was thinking while you were talking, I was also thinking of us as readers, how we sometimes have to like imagine a lot of things to try and analyze what we're reading as literature and all of this. And then I'm talking about this. I think I had some comments I was thinking, because I remember like while I was reading your book, and then I have a quote. Because the book I read, I think it was our last novel, right? Careers for Women.
I have a collection of stories out, but yeah, that was my last novel.
Yep. Oh, that one I didn't know about. So you're more than 11 books now, right? Yeah. Okay, but then the quote from this Careers for Women that I was thinking about was like, when the narrator is saying, I hadn't thought of to question the ethos I'd inherited from generations of housewives. My mother, my grandmother, my aunts all made it clear that they pitied working women.
I know.
Successful ladies did not have to work for a living. And then she was like, oh, I found a job just to find a man to marry me. And I was thinking, I was remembering when we're talking about this book, Careers for Women, like the careers that might be available for women at that time. And then there's this character that like imagines herself as a writer, right? She's trying to write something and trying to imagine. And I was wondering like if you could talk a little bit for our audience that might not be familiar with your work about your career, right? As a writer a little bit. So how did that started writing, and how is your career like?
Well, I identified myself as a writer early on, and I think back and wonder why I did that. I'm not sure. Something in the air made me think I was a writer at a very young age. I just wanted to tell stories. Sometimes I attribute it, and I've said this in interviews, that I was so in love with playing make-believe games. I just loved make-believe. I just loved childhood games, and I couldn't give it up. So that's why I became a writer of fiction. It's a way to keep playing the games but do it in a adult way. So so that's one explanation. I also think as a reader, I found great comfort in books and wanted to somehow return that to the world. So I found myself on the path very early in life, and then just pursued it, just kept going, trying to learn what I needed to know, and I'm still learning in order to start writing.
Okay, I think there was a question that okay, so Jonathan asks, I'm thinking that when we try to represent this invitation to imagining, the painters develop the grotesque pictures. Am I right? Is there a link between imagination and grotesque?
Absolutely. You know, I almost included the 19th century poet Blake, who is, creates really fantastic, fanciful, grotesque images, both as an illustrator and a poet, really investigating the nature of the grotesque. I think it has to do with our two things I'll say. One, just the way Freud described the imagined capacity of the mind. It's uncensored, and so we let ourselves imagine things we might not think reasonably about. But I also feel that there's a long history to this. When I did a little study I lived in Firenze for a couple of years and did just a amateur study of images of representations of hell and Last Judgment, and I thought it was so interesting because in in anything that was above ground, the purgatory and heaven were all absolutely regimented, but the artists could do anything they wanted with the representations of hell. They could have monsters, they could have fornication, they could have, the most violent or erotic scenes. There was no censoring in images of hell. So somehow the grotesque becomes the imagination when it's turned to art is in its most uncensored form turns to the grotesque. Yeah.
I'd have to agree.
Yeah.
I think because he was a former student of mine.
Oh,
so,
good question.
Yeah, and that's like my topic, and we were talking about hell and all, and I was thinking like the grotesque. We have like discussed. I think other conferences have talked about grotesque and cannibalization in Angela Carter's work before in this event. And I was in remembering on the topic of imagination and hell that there's a quote from Connor which says that in her diary, in her journal actually, and she says that for her it's much easier to imagine hell than the heaven, because she thinks that hell would be much similar to reality, and heaven, if it is anything like people imagine it, would be a very dull place to be. And I was thinking, it does make a lot of sense.
I love that. That is wonderful. That is wonderful. Wow. Amazing.
Yes, I was thinking that. Well, I think we were getting a lot of people were that I have never seen, like they were talking about how wonderful and inspiring talk. I don't know everybody that is commenting, so
okay. Well, thank you all. This was I feel just honored to be invited to the conference, and I'm so glad we can do it this way. But hopefully one day soon we can all be in person, and I think that's still so important to do. So but I really thank you for giving me this time to talk and for listening. So thank you.
Yeah, and I thank you for like being able to come. And I was thinking about the connections and all of this. I was remembering them because I have to say it was intriguing when I was reading a novel about how you organize what was gonna come first and later. Actually, I was reading Liberation as well, but I haven't finished, so I'm not gonna talk about Liberation. So about this story, well, while you were reading this story, I was wondering, I was imagining like how are everything going to be connected? Although you explained in the beginning, but I just understood it in the end. So about this force of association, right? That you would use to put things on display and not chronologically. So I was wondering, like, these associations that we were making are so, I don't know, like I have to say unusual, right? How we met and everything that happened later, and the associations with all the writers. So I wanted to thank you very much for being able to be here. It was an unusual association. I think it was like uh, uh, um, it was an honor to have you here, and I would like to thank you very much
Thank
for your
you.
time. Thank everybody that is working in the event. Thank everybody that was listening. Also, I would like to clarify that although Joanna Scott has not been published in Brazil in Portuguese, we still, I think I was, last time I checked, we were able to purchase the books, and not only on Kindle, but we are able to here. So
Yeah,
that's the thing.
yay.
Yes, and
Well,
so
there's a collection of stories that, you know, maybe you could get on. I don't know if it would be, if you could get a hard. Well, you could get a hard copy, but the stories, the new collection of stories is titled "Excuse Me While I Disappear."
mhm. Okay, there is another question that just got here. What do Angela Carter's characters and her writing have to tell us about the criticism of female competitors? What about personalities who do not feel represented by feminism? I don't know if I understand your
Mhm.
question very well, Liz.
I would say that's a question. That is such an interesting question. And I think that's a question we should leave unanswered. As I said, imagination sometimes ask questions and leaves them unanswered because it's such a big one. And
Yes,
I think that's the question that you need to take into a long discussion. And I bet some very interesting ideas will come out of that.
yes. And I would ask Luis to ask this question again tomorrow, tomorrow evening, to Professor Cleide Rapucci, because maybe she'll have time and she'll think of an answer for you, Luis.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So I would also invite everybody that's watching us to be with us again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Is it? If please somebody can confirm to me the schedule of the event. So tomorrow I think 9:30 will be again and have another conference, and also tomorrow we'll have a conference in the evening as well to close the event. So I hope everybody is here to join us again. And thank you very much for your presence and for Joanna and everybody involved. Thank you so much and see
Thank
you tomorrow.
you. Bye. It was really
Bye
great to
bye.
see you, Deborah, on the screen. Thanks to all. Bye-bye.